Currently, pretty much the entire global economy feels like a propped up scam. Trillions in corporate value, investor musical chairs, and hollow venture capital. But tech firms especially appear to be engaging in something called circular finance. OpenAI gives money to Oracle so that Oracle can buy more cards from Nvidia, while Nvidia invests back into OpenAI, and around they go. Meanwhile, everybody's stock price goes through the roof, which makes the investors happy, so the cycle continues and the bubble gets bigger and bigger until eventually it all comes crashing down. I don't know precisely when that will happen, but rest assured it will inevitably happen. Still, I've talked about that concept before multiple times, so today I want to focus on a different company, one that's undergone multiple similar cycles with some of the most broken underlying business practices I've ever seen and some of the most vibrantly waving red flags you can possibly imagine. Obviously, as per the video title, that company is Carvana, which I believe is a perfect example of what happens when greedy people create a bad business with nowhere to possibly end up other than bankruptcy. For anyone who isn't aware, Carvana is a used car reseller, sort of, with a near $40 billion valuation. Initially founded in 2012 by a man named Ernest Garcia III as a subsidiary of another company called DriveTime, Carvana has already gone through a complete cycle of bubble, burst, almost bankrupt, and now an even larger bubble again. Just as a brief overview, the company IPO'd at $15 a share, experiencing relatively impressive growth over the first couple of years, but it wasn't until 2020 with the COVID pandemic that things went parabolic. Massive influx of stimulus packages, high unemployment paychecks, and the increasing demand for online retailers during widespread shutdowns drove the company's share price into the high 300s. But considering the fact that the COVID shutdowns and the excess consumer spending, which built up as a direct result of them, were temporary, Carvana had nowhere to go but down. In the span of about a year and a half, the company cratered to an all-time low, down over 99% from its previous high, because the business model is shit. Obviously, we can see that the cycle is now repeating itself. Carvana went from high 300s to just $3 and is now back to the mid 300s. But why don't we take a look at how the business actually operates? Just to get the ball rolling here before we do that, the CEO of Carvana, Ernest Garcia III, as well as pretty much every single other internal executive, but the CEO by far the most of those people, has been aggressively selling tens of millions of dollars worth of the company's stock from a multi-generational trust almost every single calendar day, like clockwork. In a vacuum, it doesn't really mean all that much, never a good sign, but certainly not always bad. Yet, what should the takeaway be when the highest ranking members of a company are only ever selling hundreds of thousands of shares in their own business? Also, the key term to remember for later is multi-generational. Anyway, Carvana is a used car resale platform originally created in 2012 and spun off in 2017. But what do they actually do? Short version, they buy cars from everyday people, often paying more than their competitors, and they sell those cars later to new customers, often charging less than their competitors. On paper, that's amazing. Operate at scale, offer the best prices, get tons of business, boom, profit. Except if you dig deeper, even just a tiny bit deeper, the picture monumentally changes. See, when people buy cars, they're not actually buying the car. They're taking out a loan to buy the car. And if you go to Carvana's website, right there on the financing page, you can see, quote, 99% approval rate, all credit situations welcome, end quote. That's honestly fantastic from a consumer perspective. If you need a vehicle, Carvana is almost certainly willing to sell you one. But now let's look at the details, right? Yeah, it turns out that Carvana's only requirements are that customers be 18 plus, earning at least $5,100 per year, not per month, per year, with no bankruptcies. That's it. Back in 2024, which isn't all that long ago even, it was even lower, by the way. It was just $4,000 per year, which means that by these metrics, like a high school senior, for example, working 2 days a week at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks, could easily finance a vehicle with Carvana. I'll spare everyone the boring analysis of their current offerings and the math and everything else, but basically, Carvana self-advertises a 99% approval rate with requirements and pricing where the absolute bare minimum you can find is in the range of $200 per month, which lets anyone earning a little over $5,000 annually to get a car with a loan that requires almost 50% of their entire annual income locked away behind it. At the risk of repeating myself, this is a business model built around the concept of vehicle accessibility. But what if I told you that auto loan delinquency, as in people not paying back their car loans, was up over 50% since 2010? That's a long time, sure, for not that much of a change. Well, a big change, but not like 500% or something. But during the same period, on average, almost every other type of default is dramatically down. Home equity, personal loans, mortgages, all of these are getting paid off, even more consistently over the years. But auto loans are the very first thing that people stop paying when times get tough. For the sake of terminology, loans are typically broken down into three separate categories: subprime, near prime, and prime, which indicate the likelihood that the borrower actually makes the payments. For clarity, subprime carries the highest risk, and that's exactly what Carvana deliberately targets. Now for the fun part. When you use Carvana, taking out a loan for that sweet new vehicle, well, used vehicle in this case, the loan itself is serviced by a company called Bridgecrest, which is another subsidiary of DriveTime, just like Carvana used to be. But now we need to clarify ownership. Carvana itself is a publicly traded company, yes, but at the very same time, it also exists as something called a controlled company, because the CEO, Ernest Garcia III, and the CEO's father, Ernest Garcia II, who also owns DriveTime, have majority voting power, and thus they make all of the actual decisions. It's a little bit complicated if you break down the entire spiderweb, but the general point is that Carvana initially began as a subsidiary of DriveTime until it was spun off and IPO'd to the public. Meanwhile, DriveTime created Bridgecrest way back in 2003 to service their auto loans, and now Bridgecrest also works with Carvana. In essence, the son owns Carvana, the dad owns the company that offers the loans to Carvana customers. So far so good, but it only gets stickier from there. Ernest Garcia II, a used car market billionaire now, pled guilty in 1990 to felony bank fraud after contributing to the Lincoln savings and loan scandal of the 1980s and 90s. In particular, he arranged a complex real estate deal so that Lincoln's parent company could improperly siphon away money, and he faced a conviction for that. Of course, we don't prosecute white-collar crime even remotely harsh enough in this country, so he only got like 3 years probation. But the journey was far from over, because DriveTime, the company he now owns on top of Bridgecrest, which is where Carvana customers are sent for their loans, DriveTime wasn't always called DriveTime. Back in the 1990s, the company was called Ugly Duckling, and it was also publicly traded at the time. But in the early 2000s, after multiple failed attempts previously, Ernest Garcia Sr., as in the second, took Ugly Duckling private for $3.53 per share, which was less than half of its original price, as in everybody lost a shit ton of money. And even more notably, during the final years of its runtime, Ugly Duckling shareholders filed not one, not two, not three, four, five, but 6 different lawsuits against him for abusing his position to profit off of company assets. He settled these suits while taking the company private, but flash forward, and the man convicted of felony fraud is now overseeing the loan servicing company for his son's used car platform, which has unbelievably low standards for who qualifies and somehow beats all of their competition for prices in and prices out. Carvana isn't a used car company. It's a debt company that brings in subprime auto loans, as in auto loans from people who are the least likely to pay them, and offloads them onto an affiliate, which is owned by the criminally convicted fraudster father of the CEO. I don't know if I'm doing a good enough job selling it right now, but that's a lot of fucking red flags, man. Still, if you take the time to then look at the actual car figures, it doesn't even get better. According to March 31st, 2025 filings, Carvana had $1.5 billion worth of vehicles, which are listed as assets of the company. But as of June 30th of 2025, 1 quarter later, Carvana had over $2 billion of vehicle assets. If you then go backwards in 2024, you continue to see inventory growth. And yes, fluctuations, wild fluctuations in their inventory do certainly happen. But the last time they experienced a glut of that size, which continued to then grow, was right about the same time they almost went bankrupt because they massively overextended. It turns out if you buy a shit ton of cars for more than they're worth, because cars happen to be a rapidly depreciating asset, every year they lose like 8 to 12% of their value or something. If you buy a lot of that asset, you can't exactly turn a reliable profit by selling them back to people who can't even afford the car to begin with. Let me take a step back here and speculate. We know for a fact that Carvana uses Bridgecrest, which is a private company underneath DriveTime, which is owned by Ernest Garcia II. We also know that he was convicted of bank fraud and that he is currently making billions of dollars, with a B, billions, selling Carvana stock all the time. How far-fetched would it be if Carvana was buying and selling as many cars as they can to people who can't or likely won't pay back these loans, a lot of them, rapidly inflating their metrics, then offloading the debt or even excess inventory perhaps on Bridgecrest and DriveTime? The father and the son continue to make billions of dollars by just perpetually dumping their shares every single day. And even if DriveTime or Bridgecrest is losing money hand over fist, the fact that Carvana stock is able to go this astronomically high, despite a fundamentally garbage business model, means that more than likely they come away with insane levels of profit. How far-fetched is it to propose a theory that Carvana has no actual tangible runway of profitability? It never did, and it likely never will. But the purpose of the company is not to turn a profit. The purpose of the company is to exist for as long as feasible, while a father and son dump as much as they possibly can on investors. As far as I can tell, there seem to be very clear indications of this happening, by the way, in their financial data. We can see other sales and revenue, as well as wholesale sales and revenue, for hundreds of millions of dollars from, quote, related third parties, which would be something like DriveTime, presumably, because the father of the CEO, as they jointly control the company, owns that too. Are we starting to see the conflict of interest here? To be clear, this isn't exactly an industry secret. There's plenty of people getting wise to what's happening right now, including a 320-page lawsuit at the moment by two pension funds, alleging that Carvana is operating a pump and dump scheme for the benefit of its owners. The first iteration of that lawsuit was dismissed because it was an impermissible puzzle, as it's called, which basically means it didn't quite link all the parties together well enough. But that really just means rewrite it better and come back to me from the judge, which they did. And now that lawsuit, I believe, is making its way through the system actively. On page 2, we can see, quote, this scheme required Carvana to 1. Enter into a sham pass-through sales agreement with DriveTime to increase its reported sales, 2. Flout state motor vehicle title and registration laws and regulations, 3. Abandon its purchasing and verification standards, 4. Obscure critical metrics relating to its retail GPU, 5. Implement an unsustainable nationwide expansion, 6. Conceal critical information relevant to its average days to sale measure, and 7. Misrepresent its per vehicle profitability, end quote. And, just to ultimately round out the picture fully, Carvana has openly admitted to violating state laws when it comes to title and registration. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything in the lawsuit is true, but point number 2 absolutely is. In the end, just in case anyone out there is curious about this, I do not hold a financial stake in the company whatsoever. I have no short positions, no options, no nothing. But in the world where bubbles typically pop and leave financial ruin in their wake, it's fascinating for me to witness round 2 of this one, as Carvana comes back from the brink with what I believe to be one of the most blatantly obvious fraud business models out there. And yet, Wall Street analysts are chiming in and day out, throwing gas on the fire and proclaiming mid-$400 price targets for this stock. I don't want to sit here and say I'm smarter than the Wall Street analysts, but if Carvana ends up crashing and we find out later down the line that Ernest Garcia has to plead guilty to felony fraud again, or maybe his son might have to, yeah, maybe I am smarter than the analysts in that case. That's it. If you want to sell your car, definitely use Carvana. Best prices out there. Some people even turn a profit on their car after putting like 20,000 miles on it and selling it to them. But if you want to buy one, I'd be a lot more careful. And if you want to look at the underlying business, it's like a waddling porcupine of neon red flags. Anyway, if you want to support the channel, check out the links down below. A special VPN deal. Everybody needs one of those. Locals and Patreon, channel memberships, the Upper Echelon website, etc., etc. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching. Question everything, and have a nice night.